The Utah sunset painted the desert landscape in shades of blood and gold, casting long shadows across the valley where Samuel "Sam" Garrett had spent the last 15 years building his life from nothing. His ranch sat in a natural basin surrounded by red rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments to a forgotten god. The land was harsh but honest. It gave back exactly what you put into it, no more and no less. Sam had learned to appreciate that kind of brutal fairness after too many years dealing with people who promised everything and delivered nothing. At 53, Sam was a man carved from the same red stone that surrounded his property. His face bore the permanent squint lines of someone who'd spent decades under the desert sun, and his hands told the story of every fence he'd built, every well he'd dug, and every stubborn cow he'd wrestled to the ground. He'd come to Utah Territory after the Civil War, carrying nothing but a cavalry discharge and a bone-deep weariness with a violence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The isolation of the high desert had been exactly what he needed. Space to heal, space to build something worthwhile, and space to forget the things he'd done in service to causes that now seemed meaningless. The ranch itself was modest but well-maintained, consisting of a sturdy log house, a large barn, several corrals, and outbuildings that served various functions in the daily operation of a working cattle ranch. Sam ran about 200 head of hardy desert stock that could thrive on the sparse vegetation and find water in places that would defeat most animals. It wasn't a rich man's operation, but it provided a decent living, and more importantly, the kind of peace that money couldn't buy. He was checking the fence line in the east pasture when he first saw her, a distant figure mounted on a horse that was clearly on its last legs. Even from a quarter-mile away, Sam could see that both horse and rider were in distress. The animal's gait was labored and unsteady, while the rider swayed in the saddle with the loose-limbed exhaustion of someone who'd been pushed far beyond their limits. As they drew closer, Sam could make out more details that painted a picture of desperation and flight. The woman, for it was clearly a woman despite her men's clothing, was covered in trailed dust and what looked like dried blood. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her eyes held the wild, hunted-looking animal that had been running from predators for too long. Her horse, a paint mare that had once been beautiful, was foam-flecked and trembling with exhaustion. The animal's breathing was labored, and Sam could see that it wouldn't be able to carry its rider much farther without collapsing. The woman pulled up about 50 yards from where Sam stood, her hand resting on the butt of a rifle that protruded from a saddle scabbard. Her eyes darted constantly between Sam's face and the surrounding landscape, as if expecting pursuit to appear at any moment. "Water," she said, her voice cracked and hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "Please, my horse." Sam studied her face, noting the high cheekbones and bronze complexion that spoke of Native American heritage, though her clothing and equipment suggested someone who moved comfortably in the white world as well. More importantly, he saw something in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror during the dark years after the war, the look of someone who had seen too much and lost too much, but who refused to give up the fight for survival. Sam led the woman and her exhausted horse to the main water trough near the barn, his movements calm and unthreatening despite the obvious tension radiating from his unexpected visitor. The paint mare drank greedily, her flanks heaving with the effort of simply staying upright. Sam could see that the animal was well-bred and had once been magnificent, but days of hard riding across the desert had taken a severe toll. While the horse drank, Sam fetched a dipper of cool water from the well and offered it to the woman. She accepted it with shaking hands, drinking deeply before finally seeming to remember basic caution. "Thank you," she said, her voice still rough but stronger now. "I can pay for the water and feed." Sam shook his head. "No need. Water's free to anyone who needs it out here." He gestured toward the barn. "Your horse needs rest and grain. She won't make it much farther without both." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion worn with exhaustion and the obvious need for shelter. "I can't stay long. People are looking for me." "What kind of people?" Sam asked, though his tone made it clear that she didn't have to answer if she chose not to. The woman hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "The kind who carry wanted posters and collect bounties. I'm worth $500 to the right person." Sam whistled softly. $500 was serious money, The kind of reward that would bring every bounty hunter and opportunist in the territory. Whatever this woman had done, or was accused of doing, it was significant enough to warrant a small fortune in reward money. "Got a name?" he asked. "Sarah," she replied, then added after a moment, "Sarah Wolf Running." The name confirmed Sam's suspicion about her heritage. She was Native American, probably Ute or Shoshone based on her appearance and the territory they were in. The fact that she was being hunted by bounty hunters suggested that whatever trouble she was in likely involved a complex and often violent relationship between white settlers and the indigenous peoples of the region. Sam had served in the cavalry during the Indian Wars, and he'd seen enough of that particular brand of injustice to last several lifetimes. "Well, Sarah Wolf Running," he said, "your horse is about done in, and you don't look much better. Barn's got clean straw and room for both of you. There's a creek about 100 yards behind the house, if you want to wash up." Sarah's eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of deception or hidden motive. "Why would you help me? You don't know me, don't know what I'm accused of. For all you know, I could be a killer." Sam was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains where the last light of day was fading into purple shadows. "Had a sister once," he said finally. "She got herself into some trouble back in Missouri. Nothing serious, just fell in with the wrong crowd. But the law came after her anyway, and she ended up running scared through country she didn't know, with people hunting her like she was some kind of animal." He paused, the old pain visible in his weathered features. "She died out there, alone, scared, and far from anyone who gave a damn about her. So when I see someone in the same situation," he shrugged, "maybe I'm trying to make up for not being there when she needed me." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of shared loss and the kind of bone-deep loneliness that came from being cut off from everything familiar and safe. This man, this stranger, was offering her something that had been absent from her life for too long. Simple human kindness without conditions or expectations. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning more than just the words to convey. "I won't bring trouble to your house." Sam smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "Trouble has a way of finding me regardless. Might as well be trouble that serves a good cause." As night settled over the Utah desert, Sam prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and coffee while Sarah tended to her exhausted horse in the barn. The paint mare, whose name was Singing Bird, had been her companion for 3 years, a gift from her father during happier times when the future had seemed full of possibility rather than constant danger. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, rubbing down the horse's sweat-stained coat and checking for injuries that might have been sustained during their desperate flight across the high desert. The physical activity helped calm her nerves, which had been stretched to the breaking point by weeks of constant vigilance and the knowledge that professional killers were following her trail. When she finally returned to house, Sarah found Sam waiting with 2 plates of hot food and a cup of coffee that smelled like salvation. They ate in comfortable silence, both understanding that some conversations were better saved for when trust had been established and defenses lowered. The food was simple but well prepared, and Sarah realized that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. "You're a good cook," she said, surprising herself at the observation. "Had to learn," Sam replied. "Gets lonely out here, and a man needs something to occupy his time besides just watching cattle graze." He paused, studying her face in the lamplight. "You want to tell me what kind of trouble you're running from? Might help me know what to expect if those bounty hunters come calling." Sarah set down her fork and was quiet for so long that Sam thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief and fresh anger. "My name is Sarah Wolf Running, and I'm the daughter of Chief Standing Bear of the Northern Ute. 3 months ago, territorial agents came to our reservation claiming that my father had been selling weapons to hostile tribes. They had no proof, just accusations from a whiskey trader who owed my father money and wanted revenge." Her hands clenched into fists as she continued. "They arrested him during a tribal council meeting, dragged him away in chains while his people watched. He died in their jail 2 weeks later. They said it was pneumonia, but I saw the bruises on his body when they finally let us claim him for burial." Sam felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same rage that consumed him during his cavalry years when he'd witnessed similar injustices perpetrated by men who were behind badges and government authority. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "Your father was a good man." "The best," Sarah replied, tears threatening but held in check by years of hard-earned discipline. "He tried to find a peaceful way for our people to live alongside the white settlers. He signed treaties, followed their laws, even sent me to their schools so I could serve as a bridge between our worlds. But in the end, none of it mattered. They killed him anyway." "And now they're after you," Sam observed. Sarah nodded. "They say I killed the whiskey trader who made the false accusations against my father. Say I shot him down in cold blood and stole his money." She met Sam's eyes directly. "They're right about the killing, but wrong about the reason. He wasn't just a whiskey trader. He was selling rifles to Apache war parties and then blaming my father for the weapons they used against settlements. I had proof, documentation that would have cleared my father's name and exposed a real criminal. But when I tried to present it to the territorial authorities, they weren't interested in the truth." Sam understood the implications immediately. "So you took justice into your own hands." "I confronted him, demanded that he tell the truth about what really happened. He pulled a gun on me, and I shot him in self-defense. But by then, the damage was done. My father was already dead, and I was branded as a murderer." Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge. "The irony is that they're offering $500 for my capture, while the man who actually committed treason against the United States is being buried as a victim." Sam woke before sunrise, as was his habit, but something felt different about this particular morning. The air was too still, too quiet, as if the desert itself was holding its breath in anticipation of significant events. He dressed quickly and stepped onto the front porch, his eyes automatically scanning the horizon for anything unusual. What he saw made his blood run cold. The hills surrounding his ranch were lined with riders, dozens of them, sitting motionless on their horses like ancient sentinels guarding the approaches to his property. Even in the pre-dawn gloom, Sam could make out enough details to know that these weren't ordinary travelers or even the bounty hunters he'd been expecting. These riders carried themselves with the disciplined bearing of warriors, and their numbers suggested a coordinated operation of considerable scope and importance. Sarah emerged from the barn, leading her refreshed horse, and stopped short when she saw the riders. Her face went pale, but not with fear, with something that might have been recognition or perhaps resignation. "Friends of yours?" Sam asked quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he always kept near the door. "My people," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and apprehension. "My father's war band, and others who rode with him. They've come to see that justice is done." As the sun crested the eastern mountains, the true scope of the gathering became apparent. Sam counted at least 400 mounted warriors spread across the hills and ridges that commanded his ranch. They were positioned with military precision, controlling every approach and exit from the valley. It was the largest concentration of Native American fighters Sam had seen since the final campaigns of the Indian Wars, and their presence here was clearly no accident. "They've been tracking me," Sarah explained, noting Sam's concerned expression. "Not to capture me, but to protect me. When word spread that I was being hunted by bounty hunters, the tribal council sent warriors to ensure that I received fair treatment." She paused, her eyes fixed on a group of riders who were slowly descending from the nearest ridge. "The man in the lead is my uncle, Bear Claw. He was my father's war chief and closest advisor. Bear Claw was an imposing figure even at a distance, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention and respect. He rode a magnificent black stallion and wore traditional war dress decorated with eagle feathers and beaded patterns that told the story of his deeds in battle. Behind him rode a carefully selected group of the tribe's most respected warriors, men whose reputations for courage and honor were known throughout the territory. The war party approached Sam's ranch with deliberate slowness, their movements calculated to project strength without appearing immediately threatening. They stopped about 100 yards from the house, close enough to be clearly seen, but far enough away to avoid triggering any defensive reactions from the ranch's inhabitants. Bear Claw urged his horse forward, separating himself from his warriors in a gesture that demonstrated both confidence and respect for the protocols of diplomacy. "I am Bear Claw the Northern Ute," he called out in English, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "I come to speak with a white man who gave shelter to my sister's daughter." Sam stepped down from the porch, his rifle held casually but visibly, understanding that this was a moment that required both courage and careful consideration. "I'm Sam Garrett," he replied, "and Sarah Wolf Running is welcome in my house for as long as she needs sanctuary." Bear Claw nodded approvingly, recognizing in Sam's words and bearing the kind of honor that transcended racial boundaries. "You have shown kindness to one of our own when others would have turned her away for the sake of reward money. This will be remembered." The war chief's eyes moved to Sarah, who had stepped forward to stand beside Sam in a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes about the trust that had developed between them. "Niece," Bear Claw said, switching to you for a moment before returning to English, "the people have been worried. There are many who hunt you, and not all of them care whether you are taken alive." The town of Cedar Ridge lay 5 miles east of Sam's ranch, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, like a small organism trying to survive in the vast emptiness of the Utah desert. The community had grown up around a way station for travelers heading to California, and it served the scattered ranches and mining claims that dotted the territory. It was not a particularly prosperous place, but it was civilized enough to have a sheriff, a general store, and a saloon where men could drink away the loneliness of frontier life. On this particular morning, 3 strangers rode into Cedar Ridge with the purposeful air of men who had business to conduct. They were bounty hunters, professionals who made their living tracking down fugitives and delivering them to the authorities for reward money. The leader of the group was a man called Vance Kirby, a former cavalry sergeant who had turned to bounty hunting after the Indian Wars ended, and regular army pay became insufficient for his needs and ambitions. Kirby was 45 years old, lean and weathered, with pale eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for bringing in his quarries regardless of whether the wanted poster specified dead or alive. His companions were cut from similar cloth. Jake Morrison, a former Texas Ranger with a quick temper and fast a gun, and Tom Bradley, an ex-Pinkerton detective who specialized in tracking people across difficult terrain. Together, they represented nearly 60 years of experience in the art of hunting human beings, and they had never failed to collect on a bounty once they had taken a contract. The reward poster they carried bore Sarah Wolf Running's image and description, along with a substantial sum being offered for her capture. $500 was enough money to keep all 3 men comfortable for a year, and they had no intention of letting such a prize slip through their fingers. They had traced Sarah's movements across 3 territories, following a trail of exhausted horses, frightened witnesses, and small towns where a desperate woman had briefly sought supplies or shelter. "Barkeeper," Kirby said as they entered the Dusty Rose Saloon, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers to his questions. "We're looking for information about a woman who might have passed through here recently. Indian woman, riding a paint horse, probably looking pretty rough around the edges." The bartender, a nervous man named Pete Sullivan, glanced around the nearly empty saloon before answering. "Can't say as I recall anyone matching that description," he said carefully. "Course, we get all kinds of folks passing through here. Hard to keep track of everyone." Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Maybe this will help refresh your memory," he said, placing the wanted poster on the bar with a sharp crack. $500 for Sarah Wolf Running, wanted for murder in 3 territories. "Now, you sure you haven't seen her?" Sullivan's eyes widened as he took in the amount of the reward. $500 was more money than most people in Cedar Ridge would see in their entire lives, and the temptation to provide useful information was almost overwhelming. "Well," he said slowly, "now that you mention it, there was a woman came through yesterday evening. Looked like she'd been riding hard. Asked about water for her horse." "Which direction did she go?" Bradley asked, pulling out a small notebook to record the information. "North, toward the Garrett Ranch," Sullivan replied. "Sam Garrett's place is about 5 miles that way. He's got water and might take in a traveler who needed help." The 3 bounty hunters exchanged satisfied looks. After weeks of following cold trails and false leads, they finally had a solid destination and the promise of substantial payday waiting at the end of their hunt. What they didn't know was that their conversation had been overheard by several townspeople, including a young Ute man named Joseph Running Elk, who worked part-time at the livery stable. Joseph was one of the few Native Americans who moved freely between the white and Indian communities, serving as an unofficial messenger and liaison when communication between the two groups was necessary. As soon as the bounty hunters left the saloon, Joseph saddled his horse and rode hard for the hills where he knew Bear Claw's warriors were maintaining their vigil over the Garrett Ranch. The news that professional bounty hunters were in the area spread through the Ute War Party like wildfire, carried by Joseph Running Elk's urgent ride from Cedar Ridge to the hilltop positions where Bear Claw's warriors waited. The young messenger was breathless and dust-covered when he reached the war chief's command position, his horse lathered from a hard ride across the desert terrain. "Uncle," Joseph gasped, using the traditional term of respect for an elder, "3 white hunters have come to Cedar Ridge. They carry the paper with Sarah's picture and speak of the reward money." The bartender told them she went to the Garrett Ranch. Bear Claw received this information with the calm demeanor of a man who had been expecting such developments. He had spent 40 years as a war leader, and he understood that complex situations required patience, planning, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to use other forms of pressure to achieve one's objectives. The presence of professional bounty hunters changed the dynamic significantly. These were not casual opportunists or local law enforcement officers who might be reasoned with or intimidated. These were men who made their living from violence and who would not be easily deterred from their prey. "How many?" Bear Claw asked. 3, armed and mounted, riding good horses. They have the look of soldiers. Uncle, dangerous men who know their business. Bear Claw nodded grimly. 3 experienced bounty hunters will be more than a match for Sam Garrett and Sarah, even with the advantage of defensive positions and advance warning. But they would not be able to stand against 400 mounted warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. The war chief sent runners to the other band leaders, calling for a coordinated response that would demonstrate the full power and unity of a Ute people. Within minutes, the riders on surrounding hills began to move, flowing down from their positions like water finding its natural course. They moved with the fluid precision of people who had been riding together for years, their horses responding to subtle shifts in weight and pressure rather than obvious rain signals. To watching eyes, it would have appeared that the very landscape was coming alive, as hundreds of riders emerged from concealment and began to take new positions around the approaches to Cedar Ridge. The town's residents were the first to notice the change, as the distant figures that had been visible on the horizon since dawn suddenly multiplied and began to move with obvious purpose. Children stopped their games to point at the riders, while adults gathered in nervous clusters to discuss what this unprecedented gathering might mean for their small community. Sheriff Tom Walsh, a former cavalry officer who had taken a law enforcement job primarily because it offered a steady salary and relative safety, found himself facing a situation that was far beyond anything he had expected when he pinned on the badge. "Jesus Christ," he muttered as he watched the riders take positions on the hills overlooking Cedar Ridge. There must be hundreds of them. His deputy, a young man named Billy Crawford who had never seen combat of any kind, was visibly shaking as he counted the mounted figures. "What do you think they want, Sheriff? They look like they're getting ready for war." Walsh had fought in enough cavalry actions to recognize military formations when he saw them, and what was taking shape around Cedar Ridge was definitely military in nature. The Ute warriors were positioning themselves to control every road, trail, and escape route from the town, creating a perfect containment that would prevent anyone from leaving without their permission. It was a textbook example of tactical deployment, executed with a precision that spoke of extensive planning and coordination. "I don't think they're here to fight the town," Walsh said slowly, his experience taking in the details of the warriors' positioning and equipment. "If they wanted to attack Cedar Ridge, they would have done it already. This looks more like a blockade. They're keeping something in or keeping something out." The sheriff's assessment was accurate. Bear Claw had no intention of harming the innocent residents of Cedar Ridge, but he was determined to ensure that the bounty hunters who threatened his niece would not be able to escape the consequences of their actions. The town was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of frontier justice and the complex relationships between white settlers and the indigenous peoples whose lands they had claimed. Vance Kirby and his 2 companions rode out of Cedar Ridge in the early afternoon. their horses fresh and their weapons checked and ready for whatever resistance they might encounter at the Garrett Ranch. They were experienced professionals who had faced everything from desperate outlaws to corrupt lawmen, and they approached each job with a methodical preparation that had kept them alive through dozens of dangerous situations. What they were not prepared for was the sight that greeted them as they crested the ridge overlooking Sam Garrett's property. The ranch lay spread out below them like a detailed map, with every building and fence clearly visible in the brilliant desert sunlight. But surrounding the entire valley were hundreds of mounted warriors, positioned with military precision and obviously waiting for something to happen. The bounty hunters pulled up short, their horses snorting nervously as they sensed the tension in the air. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison breathed, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. "Looks like our little Indian princess has some friends." Kirby studied the scene with the practiced eye of a former cavalry sergeant, noting the disciplined spacing of the riders and the way they controlled every approach to the ranch. This wasn't a random gathering of angry Indians. This was a coordinated military operation conducted by people who knew exactly what they were doing. 400, maybe more, he said quietly, all armed, all positioned to cut off any retreat. Someone's been planning this for a while. Bradley, the former Pinkerton detective, was scanning the warriors through a small telescope he carried for long-distance observation. "I can see their leader," he reported. "Big Indian in war dress, riding a black horse. He's got about 20 men with him in what looks like a command group." The three bounty hunters found themselves in an impossible situation. Their quarry was clearly somewhere in the valley below, probably in a ranch house or a barn, but reaching her would require passing through hundreds of armed warriors who obviously had no intention of allowing that to happen. Fighting their way through such a force would be suicide, but retreat would mean abandoning the largest bounty any of them had ever pursued. "What do you want to do, Vance?" Morrison asked, his voice tight with tension. "We could try to circle around, come at the ranch from another direction." Kirby shook his head. "Look at their positions. They've got every approach covered. Even if we could get to the ranch, we'd never get out alive with the woman." He was quiet for a moment, weighing options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. "We need to try talking first. Maybe we can convince them that we're just doing our job, following the law." It was a slim hope, but professional bounty hunters learned early in their careers that sometimes negotiation could accomplish what violence could not. Kirby urged his horse forward, riding slowly down the slope toward the ranch with his hands visible and his weapons holstered. His companions followed at a distance, ready to provide covering fire if the situation turned violent. Bear Claw watched the three men approach, noting their careful movements and the way they kept their hands away from their weapons. These were experienced fighters, but they were also smart enough to recognize when they were hopelessly outnumbered. The war chief signaled to his warriors, and several dozen riders moved to intercept the bounty hunters, forming a living barrier between them and the ranch house. "That's far enough," Bear Claw called out when Kirby had closed to within 50 yards. "State your business and be quick about it." Kirby raised his hands in a gesture of peaceful intent. "I'm Vance Kirby, licensed bounty hunter operating under territorial authority. I'm here to collect a fugitive wanted for murder in 3 jurisdictions. The law says I have the right to pursue and apprehend criminals wherever they might be found." Bear Claw's expression didn't change, but several of the warriors around him made sounds of derision. "Your law," the war chief said with contempt. "The same law that murdered my brother and branded his daughter a criminal for seeking justice." The standoff in the valley continued as the afternoon sun climbed higher, creating an atmosphere of tension that seemed to press down on everyone present like a physical weight. Sam Garrett stood on his front porch beside Sarah Wolf Running, both of them acutely aware that they were at the center of a confrontation that could explode into violence at any moment. The rancher's rifle rested casually in the crook of his arm, while Sarah's hand remained near the pistol at her side, both prepared to defend themselves if negotiation failed. Vance Kirby found himself in the most challenging situation of his professional career. He was a man who had built his reputation on bringing in fugitives regardless of the obstacles, but he had never faced anything quite like this. The Ute warriors surrounding him represented not just overwhelming force, but also a moral authority that complicated the simple equation of legal pursuit and capture. These people weren't harboring a criminal. They were protecting their own from what they clearly viewed as an unjust persecution. "Let me see that warrant," Bearclaw demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "If you claim legal right to take my niece, show me the paper that grants this authority." Kirby hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached into his jacket to withdraw the folded documents that authorized his pursuit of Sarah Wolf Running. The wanted poster bore her image and description, along with the charges filed against her in 3 different territories. The reward amount, $500, was prominently displayed, along with the phrase "dead" or "alive" that gave bounty hunters broad discretion in how they carried out their work. Bearclaw examined the papers carefully, his weathered face showing no emotion as he read the formal language that branded his niece as a murderer and fugitive from justice. When he finished reading, he looked up at Kirby with eyes that held depths of anger and sorrow that the bounty hunter found uncomfortable to meet. "This paper says she killed a man named Marcus Brennan," Bearclaw said. "It does not say why she killed him or what he did to deserve death. It speaks only of murder, as if the taking of life can never be justified, even when that life belongs to a man who destroys others for profit." The war chief's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Marcus Brennan was a whiskey trader who sold rifles to Apache war bands and then blamed my brother for the weapons they used against white settlements. He grew rich from the blood of both red and white people, while Standing Bear died and chained for crimes he did not commit." Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and strong as she addressed not just the bounty hunters, but the assembled warriors who had come to protect her. "I did kill Marcus Brennan," she said, the admission carrying across the valley like a gunshot. "But I killed him in fair fight, face to face, after giving him the chance to tell the truth about what he had done to my father." She paused, her eyes fixed on Kirby's face. He chose to draw his gun rather than admit his crimes. "I was faster." The simple statement carried a weight of finality that left no room for argument or interpretation. Sarah had killed Brennan, but she had done so according to the harsh code of frontier justice that governed life and death in the territories. It was a kind of justice that bounty hunters like Kirby understood and often applied themselves when legal niceties proved inadequate to the realities of survival. "The law doesn't care about the reasons," Kirby said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Murder is murder, regardless of the circumstances. I've got a legal warrant, and I intend to carry out my duty." Bearclaw's expression hardened, and the warriors around him stirred restlessly. "Your duty," the war chief said with contempt, "is to the same government that has broken every treaty it ever made with my people. The same government that steals our land, kills our children, and calls it civilization." He gestured toward the assembled warriors. "We recognize no authority save that which comes from honor and truth. Take your warrant and leave this place, or face the consequences of your stubbornness." The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. 400 armed warriors against 3 bounty hunters represented odds that even the most confident gunfighter wouldn't consider favorable. Kirby found himself weighing professional reputation against his chances of survival, and the calculation was not encouraging. The resolution came not through violence, but through a demonstration of moral authority that transcended legal technicalities and government warrants. Sam Garrett stepped down from his porch and walked slowly toward the confrontation, his weathered face set with the determination of a man who had finally found a cause worth fighting for. The assembled warriors watched him approach, recognizing he was bearing the kind of quiet courage that earned respect regardless of race or culture. "Mr. Kirby," Sam said, his voice carrying clearly in the still desert air, "I've been listening to this conversation, and I think there are some things you need to understand about the situation you've walked into." The rancher stopped about 10 feet from the lead bounty hunter, close enough to speak conversationally, but far enough away to avoid appearing threatening. "I've lived in this territory for 15 years, and I've seen enough of what passes for justice out here to know the difference between law and right. Sometimes they're the same thing, and sometimes they're not." Kirby shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, sensing that he was about to hear something that would complicate his already difficult situation. "The law is the law," he said, but with less conviction than before. "I don't make it, I just enforce it." "The law," Sam replied, said that Standing Bear was a criminal who deserved to die in chains. The law said that his daughter had no right to defend his honor or seek justice for his murder. The law says that $500 is a fair price for bringing in a woman who fought back against the men who destroyed her family. The rancher paused, his eyes moving from Kirby to his two companions. But there's a higher law than what's written on those papers you carry. It's the law that says every human being has the right to defend themselves and their loved ones. It's the law that says truth matters more than profit, and honor matters more than convenience. Bear Claw nodded approvingly at Sam's words, recognizing in them the kind of wisdom that came from lived experience rather than legal education. The war chief had spent decades watching white men invoke the law when it served their purposes and ignore it when it didn't. But here was one who understood that true justice transcended the boundaries of race and culture. Your warrant, Sam continued, is based on lies told by a corrupt whiskey trader who grew rich by selling weapons to hostile tribes and then blaming innocent men for consequences. Sarah Wolf Running killed a traitor and a murderer, and she did it in fair fight after giving him every chance to redeem himself. The bounty hunter found himself facing a choice that would define not just his immediate future, but his understanding of his own moral code. He was a man who had spent years hunting fugitives and collecting bounties, convinced that he was serving the cause of law and order. But the evidence presented here suggested that he was being used as an instrument of injustice, chasing an innocent woman on behalf of the same corrupt system that had murdered her father. Even if what you say is true, Kirby said slowly, she's still a wanted fugitive. The authorities in 3 territories have put a price on her head. Then perhaps, Bear Claw said with quiet finality, it is time for those authorities to learn that some prices are too high to pay.